So hi everyone, I'm Kate Masury. I'm the program director at Eating with the Ecosystem. So we're another nonprofit. We've partnered with the New Bedford Fishing Heritage Center before on a number of different projects. But our mission is to promote a place-based approach to sustaining New England's wild seafood. So what I'd like to do is, Hannah asked me to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about our views on seafood and sustainability. And so I'd like to share that with you and then kind of open it up to questions where you guys can ask me all kind of your burning seafood questions, and I can help answer them for you. So I'll kind of start with just going over our perspective on seafood and sustainability. I'll go over one section that does talk about some of our local species, particularly some of our underutilized ones. And then we can kind of go back to that if you guys have more questions in that area, if that works for everyone. So I'm going to share my screen, which I think I should be able to do. Let's see. All right, here we go. All right, can you guys see this?
Yeah.
All right, and can you see it big now? Great. So as I said, at Eating with the Ecosystem, our mission is to promote a place-based approach to sustaining New England's wild seafood. And I want to kind of go over what we mean by a place-based approach. And so for us, it comes down to what we call our 5 anchors, which are really our principles of a place-based approach. And I'll kind of walk through each of them with you now. So the first one is proximity. We think that it's important that in terms of sustainability that we're eating local seafood. There's a lot of benefits to eating seafood that comes out of our local waters. One is that it's traveling less far before it reaches our plate. That's a benefit that's, the same as if you were eating local produce. But there's also kind of other connections that I think that are important in terms of eating locally. One is that, we're supporting our fishing community, the people that are catching our fish in New Bedford. You guys are, literally like the biggest port on the East Coast. You have a hugely important fishing industry there that's important part of the economy for this entire state, for the entire region. And when you eat local seafood, you're supporting those men and women who are participating in that industry. And I think that's really important. But another factor that we at Eating the Ecosystem think is important is that when we eat local seafood that comes out of our local waters, we're forming a connection with the place that produced our seafood. So we're forming connection with George's Bank, or where our scallops were harvested, or we're forming a connection with the Gulf of Maine where our haddock came from, or things like that. And that gives us an incentive to care about what's happening in that ecosystem, maybe more so than if we weren't eating seafood that was coming out of those waters. And so when, there's threats to those ecosystems that take place, then we as consumers, care a little bit more about that. And we don't want to be the ones that are causing those threats. We can kind of support causes that support those ecosystems and make sure that we have healthy ecosystems that will continue to produce healthy seafood for us. And so we're super lucky here in New England to be close to really 3 really productive marine ecosystems. We have the Gulf of Maine kind of to the north of us, where even though we're not currently on the Gulf of Maine, if you're in New Bedford, the boats fish and access those areas really easily. We have George's Bank, which is right off the coast there, and is kind of a shallow water basin, pretty far off the coast, but shallow water. So it's known for its productivity. It's where we see a lot of our ground fish, as well as I think scallops is probably what we're known for best in terms of George's Bank, and especially for New Bedford. And then we have the Mid-Atlantic Bight, and the Mid-Atlantic Bight is kind of unique in that it isn't just part of New England. It goes down to the mid-Atlantic, and it runs from basically Cape Cod down to around North Carolina. And it's a migratory pathway. And so species that might spend their summers up here during the warmer months spend their winters down in the south. And so we share those species with kind of our southern neighbors. And I think what's neat about the Mid-Atlantic Bight is it brings a huge amount of diversity to our area by carrying kind of these warmer water species up the coast. And so you get things that you wouldn't necessarily see up here in the Gulf of Maine or Georges Bank that travel along the mid-Atlantic bight and bring this wide variety of kind of species for us. And so that kind of brings us to our next anchor, which is symmetry. So as I mentioned, we're super lucky here in New England to have this wide, these 3 really productive ecosystems that are producing all this delicious seafood for us, and they're producing this huge variety of species. We land over 100 different species here in New England. So that's a huge amount of different types of fish and shellfish that we could be eating, which is awesome. And yet, typically, when we eat seafood, we think of maybe a few select species that we're eating, or a few favorites. But most people are not eating 100 species. I don't think I'm even eating 100 species. But we, maybe we're eating 3 or 4 or something like that. And so for eating the ecosystem, we think it's really important that we diversify our diet, that we balance our diet with what the ecosystem is producing. And what we mean by that is we want you to eat a diversity of species kind of in proportion to their natural abundances. So species that are really abundant and productive in our marine ecosystem should be a bigger part of our diets. Species that maybe are less abundant or less productive in our ecosystems doesn't mean that they can't be a part of our diets. They're just a smaller portion of our diets. So an example of that would be tuna, for example. Tuna are species that we do catch here locally in the warmer months. They're around, and the management has done, a good job of protecting them. The fishermen have done a good job of following the rules, and so we can eat local tuna. That's okay. But tuna are a small portion of the ecosystem. There's a lot of other species that take up a bigger role, kind of. And so tuna can be part of our diets, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we're eating. We should be eating this wide variety kind of other species. And so what I'd like to kind of show you is some of the other species that you could be eating here. And this picture actually on my right kind of shows a few of them. Actually, this picture came from actually a Rhode Island seafood dealer. But we've got black sea bass, which is one of my favorites. They're really delicious. We've got some scup, actually another one of my favorites. So we've got some soft shell clams or steamer clams, some quahogs. There's a Jonah crab claw up here in the corner that you can't really see. We've got lobster, we've got some squid, oysters, mussels, and these are just a few of the species that we could enjoy. And I want to kind of go back just for a second to talk about, why we don't want to just choose one of these fish. So let's take like scup, for example. Scup's a species that's really abundant. There's a lot of them in our local waters. The fishermen catch a lot of them, and they're great fish. And honestly, like, they're one of our underutilized fish. They're ones that we could be eating a lot more of and that we're not eating kind of that much of. And so in terms of symmetry, why it's important and why we should be eating kind of a diversity of species is, yes, we should be eating more scup. But if all we did was eat scup, if every one of us only ate scup and everybody in New England only ate scup populations are obviously going to be impacted, but so are the fish that eat scup. Their populations are going to be impacted. Fish that are eaten by scup, their populations are going to be impacted. Maybe their populations kind of explode, and that causes this cascading effect in our marine food webs. And so if all we do is eat 1 or 2 select species, that kind of changes the way that the ecosystem works. It changes that natural flow between the marine food web. And so if instead we eat a diversity of species, but kind of in proportion to their natural abundances, then we maintain those proportions. We maintain a more natural balance in those marine food webs. And that allows kind of the ecosystem to function as it should and us to have less of an impact on it. And so here are some of the more popular species that we have here. When you walk into a fish market and you think about New England species, you might think about cod or scallops or lobster or clams or haddock, for example. And those are all great species that we can be eating. They should be part of our diets because they're a part of our local ecosystem. But a lot of times when you walk into a fish market, this is kind of more commonly what you see. And I don't know how well you guys can read this, but we've got haddock here, but it's Icelandic haddock. We do have tuna. It doesn't really tell us where it's from. We've got cod here. Again, it's Icelandic cod. We've got swordfish here, and then we've got an Arctic char over here, which it's very similar to salmon, for example. And I think a lot of times when we're in our fish markets, what we see is kind of this selection of species, maybe added with a few of these other kind of local ones alongside it. And so it makes it hard for us as consumers to choose kind of these underutilized or lesser known local species when we don't see them kind of available in our fish market. And so one of the things that we can do as consumers is kind of become better educated about what species are local, and then create demand for those species and ask for them. So here are just some of, as I said, there's over 100 different local species that are landed in our local waters. But here are just some of the species that I think could be a bigger part of our diets, could be things that people in New England, in New Bedford, could be eating more of. And so I'll kind of walk through briefly each of them with you and just name them off. Up here, and can you guys see the arrow when I move it around? If I move that over here. So up here in our top left corner, we've got skate. Skate is a type of ray. So it's related to like sharks and stingrays and things like that. But it's actually incredibly delicious. The way that you see skate kind of prepared or like available in the fish market is typically as a wing. So they take off kind of the sides of the wing, and then it looks like a fillet basically. It's boneless at that point most of the time. Sometimes you'll see it that there'll be the fillet on top, and then the cartilage in the middle, and then the fillet on bottom. But most of the time when you do see it, it's just kind of a boneless fillet. And it tastes like scallops, honestly. It's very sweet. You used to hear back in the day people making kind of fake scallops out of skates and things like that. But they did that, not that people should be tricking people, but they did that because it tastes very similar. It's a very sweet kind of flavor to it that I would say kind of mimics a scallop. Texturally, I would say it's kind of unique and on its own. It's got the flakes kind of for the skate are different than like say the flakes in a haddock or a cod. They're kind of long and almost like looks like little fingers. And though it kind of makes it a little bit more stringy in texture, but really delicious. Kind of, I would compare maybe texturally to a crab meat, maybe closer than like a haddock or something, but sweet like a scallop. Below that are butterfish. I think these are some of the cutest fish in the ocean. They're small. They're about the size kind of the palm of your hand, or maybe your whole hand, depending on the size of the butterfish that you get. And typically you cook them whole. And I think that's one thing as consumers that we do need to get more used to is eating whole fish, because many of our local fish are actually more available in whole fish format. But these guys, you don't have to worry about scales really with them. The meat flakes right off the bone. So if you cook them, you can just pull that bone right out and you can still eat it as basically a boneless fish. But they're very tasty. They've got lots of natural oils in them, like omega-3s and things like that are very healthy for you and good for you. And so, yeah, I think that they're a great fish. Down here in the bottom left-hand corner is maybe one of our ugliest fish in the ocean, is our monkfish. And these ones they can get quite big. Their head is huge, but what you eat on a monkfish is actually the tail. And sometimes you hear monkfish referred to as like poor man's lobster. It's meaty in texture, kind of mild and sweet in flavor, and is a great fish if you can use it basically in any recipe that calls for a cod or haddock or any kind of mild flavored fish. But you get like a nice meaty texture with monkfish that holds up really well in soups and stews, or if you're pan searing it or things like that, you don't have to worry about it falling apart, which is really nice. Up here, kind of in this orange basket, we've got scup. I mentioned scup before. These are Actually, I really love scup. They're one of my favorite fish. I think they're beautiful, but they're also really versatile. I think that's one of the reasons that I like them so much. Typically, you'll see scup sold as a whole fish versus as a fillet. Sometimes you'll see it as a fillet. I know a few fish markets that will do that. I think scup sometimes gets a negative reputation for being kind of bony, let's say, because it is a whole fish and there are some pin bones that are in it. But I think if you cook scup whole, that's one way actually to avoid having to deal kind of with the bones that you see in a fillet that you have to pull all out. If it cook it whole, you can flake that meat right off and then pull kind of the skeleton out, and it's delicious. It's also, you can eat it raw actually, which not a lot of people know. So it makes a really good crudo or a ceviche if you like those kind of things. But it's great. You can grill it, you can fry it, you can bake it, you can do pretty much anything that you want to do with a fish, you can do with scup, which makes it a really nice fish. And it's, I would say, a medium flavored fish. So it's not as mild as say like a haddock or a cod, but it's not as strong as like a bluefish or a mackerel. It's got a little bit more flavor, but it's not like kind of a super strong flavored fish either. Below that is whiting. Whiting are actually related to cod and haddock and hake. It's in the hake family. Typically, when you see them at the market, they're smallish. They're about like say a foot long, and they're kind of thin. And they're served whole or they're sold whole. And most of the time, I would say they're also served whole. They're super delicate, kind of flaky white fish. So it's very mild, sweet in flavor. But again, I think the thing that people are a little bit intimidated about with whiting is not necessarily their flavor or texture or anything like that, but is the fact that it's typically sold as a whole fish. So it's a little bit smaller of a fish. So you do need, most of the time people do cook it whole. I think whiting are actually really popular and actually a lot of these fish are more popular kind of in different cultures, in different culinary like backgrounds. So I know that like in the Portuguese culture, for example, which is a big group in New Bedford, there's a lot of people that really enjoy whiting or and cooking them whole, and are not necessarily intimidated by that at all. Above, kind of in our middle top section, we've got mackerel. Mackerel are another, I think, kind of pretty fish. They've got that blue and black kind of stripy pattern on their back. They definitely are, they're smaller fish as well, so about the similar size to a whiting, but they're definitely a little bit stronger flavored fish. They've got that, anytime you have a fish that's really fast and kind of strong, you're going to have more of a dark meat kind of more and a more reddish meat. So if you think of tuna, those are like our fastest fish basically. They've got that red kind of dark meat and they've got that stronger flavor, right? Mackerel are going to be similar. They're a little bit different in flavor than tuna, but they've got that similar dark kind of reddish meat to them, and they're a fast fish just like a tuna is. And so they, I think, are really great grilled. I've had them roasted and they've been really delicious. A lot of people love to smoke them. A lot of times, especially with some of our stronger flavored fish, smoking helps take out some of like that stronger flavor. You get a little bit more smoke flavor to it. And so you don't let a little bit less of the fish flavor. So I think I see them smoked quite often, but they're really tasty as well if you're looking for a little bit stronger flavored fish. Below that, we've got, looks like sand crabs in the middle here. Sand crabs are also known as peaky toe crabs. And there's another type of crab that we catch here in New England called Jonah crabs, which look very similar. Are a little bit, they're both cancer crabs. So they're pretty much interchangeable in terms of recipes and how you cook them. Sand crabs tend to have a little bit more meat in the legs, whereas Jonah crabs have a little bit more meat in the claws. But otherwise, very, very similar. Both have a really sweet flavor to them, kind of a flaky meat versus a lump meat that you might find in a blue crab. And you steam them typically. So you'd steam it and then you can serve it you could put whatever seasoning you want on it. or you could pick all the meat and make a crab cake or do anything you would with normal crab. They are a little bit more work to pick than I would say like a big crab, like a king crab or something like that, just because of their size. But they're some of my favorites personally. They're, I think, incredibly sweet and delicious. Below that is squid. That is another kind of big fishery that we have here in New England. Between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, those are probably the two biggest states for landing squid in our area. And they're super versatile. I think most people see squid and they think of calamari fried, which is delicious and a great way to enjoy it. But you can do a lot more with squid than just fry it. You can grill it. You can kind of pan-sear. You can put it in, sauces and kind of braise it like low and slow over a long period of time. So there's a lot you can do with squid, and they're I think delicious and they're very productive. They're short-lived species. They produce a lot of babies. And so they're one that we can kind of just eat more of if we want. Up top, we've got the second to the right is dogfish. This is one that you might have heard a lot about in terms of underutilized species. They are a small species of shark, which does kind of intimidate some people. But you don't have to worry about kind of the sustainability issues with dogfish like you might have to worry about with like some other bigger species of shark. They're quite abundant. They're if you ask any fishermen, they're almost like a nuisance to them at times. And so they're quite abundant in our ecosystem. In terms of how you'd use them, they've got actually a white meat that's fairly flaky, but a little bit more meaty than a cod. And they're used very similarly to cod. So in fish and chips, I've had them in a curry before. That's been really delicious. But yeah, just some kind of a mild flaky fish. One thing that you do have to be aware of with dogfish is that because it is a shark, so it's natural biology, it does tend to like not have as long of a shelf life as some other fish, like say like a cod or a haddock. And so it needs to be kind of fresh, or it needs to be frozen and then you can use it whenever you want. I think that's one thing that it gets like a negative reputation for, is because it can go go bad more quickly than other types of fish. So it needs to be handled a little bit more carefully, kept on ice, kept cool, that kind of thing. Below that, that's just one of the types of clams that we land here. This is a surf clam. That's a kind of bigger offshore fishery. A lot of times if you've had clam strips or things like that at like your local clam shack, then you've had surf clams and not really even realized that you've had them. Surf clams are really sweet. They make a great chowder if you chop them up. They're big. You don't want to just eat a whole surf clam, just like pop it in your mouth. You'd be chewing for a while. But they're very delicious. They're sweet, and they're typically caught kind of offshore. Below that is pollock. Pollock is another ground fish that we have here in New England. So if you like haddock or cod, then you're going to like pollock. It's very, very similar. They're a related fish. They're, again, mild, flaky white fish. They're great for, baking or fish and chips or anything like that, chowder. Below that at the bottom, that's fluke. They're, again, I think another one of my favorite fish. They're actually increasing kind of in abundance here in New England with warmer water temperatures. And so Massachusetts, I think their quota just increased this past year. So you're going to be seeing more fluke kind of on the market. And they're a little bit different than other types of flounders in that if you look at them, they have a pretty big mouth. So they're a little bit more of an aggressive predator than say like a winter flounder. And so they actually eat a little bit more variety of things. And so I think their flesh is a little bit firmer than other types of flounders, but it's still pretty delicate, pretty flaky. It's very mild, very sweet in flavor. Fluke is another one that you can do raw, which is kind of cool. So you'll see like sushi grade fluke sometimes that are sold like to the sushi markets and stuff. Or you can just if you catch fluke yourself, you can eat it raw as long as you bleed it kind of and ice it. So fluke's delicious. I think it's another great one. You can cook it as a whole fish, or you can fillet it and do whatever you would like with it that you would do with a flounder. So they're pretty versatile as well. We've got another flounder here kind of in the middle next to the clams in the orange basket. That one looks like yellowtail flounder, but we catch about 7 different types of flounders here in New England. And one of the nice things about all the different types of flounders is culinary wise, they're all very, very similar. And so if you like yellowtail flounder, you're gonna like gray sole, you're probably gonna like winter flounder. Unless if you're an extreme seafood connoisseur and you're doing a side-by-side tasting, in most cases, you are not going to be able to tell the difference between the different flounders if you just had a fillet of it and you don't actually see the fish. So they're flaky, they're mild, they're delicious. You can do kind of a lot with them. And then our top corner over here, that's black sea bass. That's another species that has kind of increased in our area due to warmer water temperatures. They're actually a pretty aggressive predator. And so if you talk to lobstermen, they don't love the fact that the black sea bass are here because they eat small lobsters and crabs and things like that. But they're a great fish for us to eat as well. They've got this pretty black skin and then very white flesh because they eat shellfish like the lobsters and the crabs and stuff like that. They have kind of a sweet flavor to their meat, and they're great. And I think those are ones that you do maybe see filleted at the market sometimes, but also as a whole fish. So you can do it kind of either way. And they're another one that you can eat raw also if you enjoy it that way. We have quahogs over here, which sometimes people get confused with quahogs because they come in a bunch of different sizes. So you might have heard of cherry stones or little necks, top necks, chowder clams, things like that. Those are all quahogs. That's just different size categories of them. And depending on the size, you can do kind of different things with them, whether you want to use them for chowder or you want to just steam them. They're abundant and delicious. And then we have Acadian redfish below that. And that's another kind of volume fishery that they've got that pretty red skin. And then they've got a very mild, flaky white flesh that's kind of sweet in flavor also. They, I think, face similar negative perceptions, similar to scup in terms of it's a kind of a smallish, medium-sized fish that like people, a lot of times it's cooked whole and that can be intimidating to people. But I think, or if you do want to fillet it, it's a smaller fillet. And so sometimes people aren't sure what to do with that small fillet, but I think it makes a great fish taco. It's one of my favorite fish taco fishes. And yeah, and you can do a lot with it if you get past kind of the small size. So I know that was a lot. That was a lot of different fish that I just went over. In terms of like sustainability and stuff like that, we have other anchors that we care about. So the next one is adaptability. So as what's in our ecosystem changes over time, we think that as consumers, our diets should change along with it. And so that could be due to seasonal changes, or it could be due to longer term changes like related to climate change or things like that. So I mentioned black sea bass, for example, which is the picture over here, increasing in abundance due to warmer water temperatures in recent years. And so that can now be part of our diets, which is great. But we'll also see colder water species, moving north and kind of out of our area. And so we'll probably eat a little bit less of those ones. And so I think it's important that we're adaptable and that we kind of keep up to date kind of with what's happening, what we see in our fish markets. And one of the things that we can do is just, get to know our fish markets, the people behind the counter a little bit better, or get to know our fishermen. You guys are part of the New Bedford Fishing Heritage Center. So you guys are probably lucky to have a lot of great resources right there to learn about kind of your fisheries. And just kind of be aware of some of the changes that are happening. And then our next one is connectivity. And this one has less to do with about what you're eating and more about the habitats that produce our seafood. So we think in order to be sustainable consumers, we need to make sure that we take care of those habitats. And so because without them, our fish aren't going to be able to be able to breed, to feed, to grow, etc. And so we think that it involves, reducing chemicals and things like that you use in your homes or on your lawns that eventually end up in your rivers or your oceans. Making sure that, you're protecting, preventing detrimental activities for happening in those habitats. So if there was going to be like a lot of dredging or like things like that are important for fish habitats, then you're standing up, or oil drilling, or I don't know, things like that, then you would be standing up kind of and saying, like, I care about those habitats, those are important for our local seafood. And as consumers, you have a say in that. And so making sure that we're supporting those habitats as well. And then the last one is community. And this one's, we call it knowing your fishermen sometimes. And this one's just supporting your local fishing community by eating local, but also by kind of getting to know the issues that they care about and the issues that they're facing. A lot of times fishermen have a lot of obstacles kind of that they have to deal with beyond just fishing that are on the table. And so I think that getting to know kind of your local fishing community and seeing how you can support them in different ways is really important as a consumer as well, so that you continue to have, healthy fisheries and fishermen. And so this one I think is just as important as all the rest of them. And one thing that you can do to support them is eat local seafood. And so this is just a picture of some of the different fisheries that we have here. But and I can kind of go over any of those that people have questions, but I want to make sure that you guys have time to ask me questions. So what I might do is stop sharing my screen so you can probably see my face a little better. And then we can do some questions. Let's see. All right. So I know many of you guys are on mute, but if you guys want to unmute yourself to ask a question, then feel free.
Kate, that was amazing. That was amazing. That was such a download of information. Do you have that in printed matter where we could have some?
So on our website, if you go to eatingwiththeecosystem.org, right. We've got kind of the 5 anchors all laid out. We also have a page that says like it's under the local seafood, like a learn tab. There's a what's local page that talks about a bunch of the different species. We also have a local seafood resources page that has a whole bunch of information, including a ton of different recipes and things like that, or how to fillet guides and stuff like that. So I think our website's probably the best source for a lot of that information.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kate, first of all. And at the outset, you mentioned something about the threats to where we get our fish. What threats are on your mind for George's?
I mean, so I think that one thing so I think climate change is actually, a fairly big threat in terms of the health kind of the fisheries that we're used to. I think that the ecosystem, will continue to adapt, but I think that you're going to see kind of a change in species composition, and that's definitely going to impact our fishermen. At the same time, I think that wind farms are another threat, kind of to a potential threat. I guess I would say that the impacts for the wind farms are very unknown at this point. And the scale at which that they're happening is quite large, because it's not just, right off our coast, but it's going to be kind of up, or, what's predicted to be kind of up and down the eastern seaboard. And so I think that, that's can be a little bit scary in terms of knowing what impact that's going to have, and the cables and all the work is going to have on the fisheries and on the the species themselves. So I think that could be considered a threat. I think also, land-based activities like our coastal development and things like runoff from like chemicals or like sewage treatment or things like that going into our oceans are also threats in terms of our like more coastal ecosystems, like our estuarine habitats, which are actually the nursery grounds for a lot of our species. So even if we think, oh, like our fish are offshore, well, a lot of them breed or like have nursery grounds kind of in our coastal habitats. And so those are actually really important for our fisheries as a whole.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll just put in a plug for carbon too, because my husband studies CO2 effects on water pH. And so atmospheric, like acid rain and that sort of thing can affect estuary pH too. So it's not just local, it could be atmospheric.
Yeah.
And lowering of the pH, making the water more acidic, is really having an impact on shellfish in some areas of the country. It could happen here too. So that's
yeah,
one
that's
more.
a great point, Wendy. Like ocean
Yeah.
acidification, as she mentioned, is another threat specifically to shellfish, like our soft shell clams or razor clams or quahogs, things like that need that calcium carbonate to build their shells.
Right. So yeah, the estuary environment is so incredibly sensitive, and even if there's it affects the larval forms or the very small forms, they are the base of the food chain for so many other animals. So yeah, just the kind of stuff Buzzards Bay Coalition is doing is helping fishermen and us. It helps everybody. So just a general comment, Kate. I want to commend you and your organization for the way you're structuring your thinking. Like having thought through these sort of 5 anchors and then fleshing them out in a way that is really tangible. Honestly, it's extremely effective in terms of how you're able to communicate your message. And so, just my compliments to your organization for how you have thought this through. And I'm sure it wasn't that easy to choose which things are going to be your most important to communicate, because obviously you could kind of be all over the map. But I think this is a really good way to do it. And just a thought, so we have a part of our exhibition, as Hannah had mentioned, that talks about locally produced species and how one can possibly, how our little museum could possibly influence people to make different choices when they go to the supermarket. And we're like, how can we do that? Like, how can we provide this information? And a lot of it is what you just provided. Are what we mentioned in the exhibit could also be seasonal. Like, there's not just that it's local, that it's underutilized, but that also varies with season. Yeah. And so it's like, what's available now that you might not think of getting, that might be a nice thing to do. But I was also thinking, like, a fun activity that maybe families might do is you could have like a bingo card with locally available species, including some of the little, like, not so commonly purchased ones, and if people fill it out, they try 4 different things and they get bingo. They go home and then they can come back and have free admission to the museum or a prize or something. Like, in other words, it's not just like picking one species, it's picking 4. It's the range of consumption that's important, not just like, okay, I'm going to start eating stuff from now on. Like, that's not good enough.
I think that's a great idea. I think that sounds like fun.
Bingo. I think that would be fun.
The other thing that's been, and hi, I'm sorry I'm late, everybody. Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for great presentation. One thing that I was thinking of is we're intending to do some QR codes throughout the museums, even we're going to have listening stations so people can hear voices of people in the fishing community.
Cool.
But because of COVID, we're now thinking people may not want to pick up the device. But anyway, the QR code opens up a whole new possibility, right? Like we could put a QR code directed to your website.
Yeah, and one thing, and Laura, I can talk to you kind of more about this at some point, but we're actually working with the Massachusetts Department of Marine Fisheries right now. Wendy mentioned seasonality, and one of the things that we're working with them on is creating kind of a new page for their website that will share the weekly landings of what's being landed in Massachusetts, which would be, I think, a cool thing to potentially link to in the future. It's not up yet, it's in development kind of.
Yeah, no, it's ironic because we're in the very final throes of installing this huge new exhibit, and I got an email from the fabricator yesterday in a panic saying, nobody told me what to do with this particular rail that's currently on this thing, but we don't have any text for it. What's the plan? And I think everybody had somehow forgotten that there's an existing rail that doesn't have a use.
Okay, cool.
Rather than paying somebody to like remove it and clean it all up, we thought, well, maybe we should just keep it and figure out what the use it, and maybe it's a changing use, maybe it's a, recipe of the month or whatever, but it seems to me like maybe it's a series of QR codes to you, to maybe to NAMA, to Mass Division,
the
maybe
different kind of
SMS.
other organizations.
Yeah, so that people can, and it's so easy now, if you have a smartphone, you basically take a picture of that standing there and it immediately pulls up the
all the different
website or the whatever. Yeah. So we will be talking.
Laura, what's a QR code?
Oh, I'm sorry. QR code is, I don't know what the actual acronym stands for. Do you know, Liz?
No, I don't, but you've seen them, Rachel.
Right. You've all seen them. So they're like little square, it's a computer code.
Boxes with weird shapes in them.
Yeah, it's a computer code.
Quick response is what it's.
Quick response.
Quick response. Oh, look at you go, Kayla.
I Googled it.
And to be honest, it's something that's been around a long time. And I think now that smartphones are so prevalent, it's much easier to integrate them into something like a museum. In the past, I think it was, people were sort of like, well, how do I do this? And, it was a lot more steps. You don't even have to at least have an iPhone, it's an old iPhone.
Menus.
Yeah, you don't have to download software. All you do is simply take a picture and immediately it's like, would you like to go to this website?
Well, you do need an app. You
Yeah.
don't just take a picture of it. You do need an app.
I didn't
Hi,
need
this
an
is
app,
Hannah
Hannah.
again.
I didn't download
Not
any
in
apps.
a lot of restaurants, you don't. You just take it for the
Well, you
menu.
need the
Yeah.
QR code app. You're not just using
Right.
your camera. You're using the
Right.
QR code app. I'm pretty sure.
No, I've used
cameras,
my
at least
I don't
camera
think I
without it.
downloaded
Really?
any apps, so.
Yeah.
Well, we're all gonna have to go out and see if,
Yeah.
maybe your
Yeah,
phone has
that's
it,
what
my
was
phone doesn't
surprising,
have
is
it,
I don't believe I downloaded any apps, but.
Yeah, I don't
No.
have a specific QR code app, but my when I open my camera and you
Yeah.
Interesting.
enter the QR
Yeah.
code. it just
I think it's a
Okay.
newfangled thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, we will, we'll all be educated in a couple weeks on that and figure it out. So, are there more questions? Because I don't want to keep, Kate's, given us her time.
Thank you.
The last while. Thank you so much, Kate.
Right.
Thank you, Kate. That was very good.
That was
Yeah.
tremendous.
Thank you.
And I assume Hannah had some technical issues, and so she's here in voice at this point.
Is there a section on the website that talks about, like, I'm just sort of curious, like, what the background of the organization is? Like, I don't know if
we
you
have
went over
I
that
can
already.
tell you a little bit about that now, but we have
Sure.
kind of like an about us section that talks a little bit more about our mission and stuff like that, and not quite as much about our history. So we actually started as a dinner series before we were a nonprofit. So our founder, her name's Sarah Schumann, she's a fisherman, and she's also kind of a researcher and writer. She wears a lot of different hats, but she at the time was actually selling fish at a farmer's market, and she had people kind of coming up to her, and they'd be like, what is this, which options are sustainable? And she was selling all local seafood. And so she had things like skate and scup and, you know, some of the species that I taught, you know, showed you in the slideshow. And then she'd have people kind of break out their Monterey Bay Aquarium seafood watch, like little cards or app or things like that. And they wouldn't see some of the local species listed, or like, and they'd be like, oh, must not be sustainable, and they wouldn't buy them. And she was like, wait, no, like all these are, you know, can be a sustainable like part of your diet. And so instead of thinking about things on a single species level, which a lot of those other, I think, sustainable seafood approaches do, she started thinking about things on a place-based level. Like if you lived in this area, like, you know, what would it mean to kind of be sustainable? And one of the resources, or like she was also at the time learning about ecosystem-based fisheries management. And this gets a little bit more complicated, but the acronym for that is EBFM. And ecosystem-based fisheries management is kind of in contrast to single species management. So instead of just looking at how one single species of fish is doing in terms of your fisheries management, you'd look at how the ecosystem as a whole is doing, and all those species would be kind of components of that. But the factors that you would look at is, you know, the species to species interactions. You'd look at the species to habitat interactions. You'd look at, you know, climate interactions, things like that. And so it's a bigger picture kind of thing. And that's the direction that fisheries management is talking about going. They're realizing, you know, that all those things are really important, and how you actually do that in practice becomes a little bit more complicated, but that's the direction that they're going. And the language that they use when they talk about EBFM, it is place-based. And so Sarah started, like, you know, researching kind of things that way. And so she actually started doing a dinner series where she partnered with local restaurants, as well as she had researchers come and talk about their work. And then she'd have fishermen come and talk about the species that they caught, and it would all be in relation to what you were eating that night for dinner. The chefs would have crafted kind of a menu that told the story kind of about the local ecosystem and the fisheries and the species. And kind of connected you to all of that. And people really enjoyed them. We still typically do dinners. We haven't done dinners in the last year because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to be able to, you know, bring those back eventually. But yeah, it started as a dinner series, and then kind of evolved into a nonprofit.
Is this based in New Bedford?
So we're actually based in Rhode Island, but as an organization, we consider ourselves regional. And so we've done work all over New England. Most of our event-based work tends to be Southern New England, which would include New Bedford. But like, you know, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut kind of, although we have done some stuff up in Maine and elsewhere.
Is there a kitchen where a kitchen dummy like I could go and learn how to cook some of these less used species?
Yeah, so before the pandemic, we used to run cooking classes actually at Hope in Maine and Warren, Rhode Island, which is like a culinary incubator that has a demonstration kitchen. And so we've run cooking classes out of there. Actually, this summer and fall, we did some virtual cooking classes where you join via Zoom, just like this. And we had a chef who was teaching from their own home kitchen. And we actually had a fisherman join. And actually, it was really cool because you got to cook like in your own space, which is what you would be doing normally. And so I think it was very hands-on because you were the one having to actually prepare your own meal. So we may bring those back at some point. We got kind of busy with other things and had to take kind of a break from them for a little while, but we may bring those virtual classes back at some point, or come back to doing some in-person cooking classes once we're able to. But cooking classes is something that we do. We often also, again, during non-pandemic times, do cooking demonstrations where we have we call it our food boat, but it's a boat on a trailer that we bring around to outdoor events, and it's got like a counter surface on it and a canopy that goes over the top, and we can bring chefs on board to do cooking demonstrations from that. So we did the Big Boats, Little Boats Festival with you guys at the New Bedford Fishing Heritage Center. Was that last year, Laura, or 2 years ago, whenever that was.
2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, it was 2 years. It was Hannah had just arrived, I think.
Yeah.
It was like weeks after she started. So yeah, September 2019. That was great.
So we do cooking demonstrations and stuff sometimes too, but as of right now, we're waiting till things are a little bit easier to do that.
Are you guys like grant funded?
We are, yeah, we're primarily grant funded.
Sounds like a really cool organization.
Mm-hmm.
I have one question about the symmetry concept. So I guess the idea is to encourage consumers or ourselves to eat a range of species that reflects, is it the landings in your local area, or is it the productivity in the local area, or do you not like worry about the difference? Like, is it what people are taking in? Because I know demand can drive what's landed. Like, how do you balance that?
In theory, it's the productivity of the ecosystem. Like, so what the ecosystem is actually producing, not necessarily what is landed. In practice, it because you're right, you know, like what we demand as consumers has an influence over what is caught kind of in our fisheries. And so in theory, it's that we as consumers will demand kind of and create demand for all of those species that are part of the ecosystem. That being said, there's obviously management and like regulations that could, you know, influence that. But in practice, just eating a diversity of species and not worrying too much about the differences between the productivity and kind of what's being caught is totally fine. Like we don't we're like in a perfect world, we'd know exactly what the productivity of the ecosystem is. And if 10% of the ecosystem consisted of monkfish, then 10% of our diet would consist of monkfish. And if 5% of the ecosystem consisted of scup, then 5% of our diet would consist of scup. But I don't know that information that would be very hard for all of us to figure out. It's going to change over time and over seasons and stuff like that. So in practice, what it means is just eating kind of a wide diversity of species and being kind of adaptable to the changes that you see and, you know, reflecting that in your diets.
Oh, Kate, you've inspired me. I'm married to a fisherman, so watching your slides, I thought how lucky I am. I can say anytime, Bill, bring home something we've never had. And so I sometimes I take it for granted. So that's made me and also inspired to eat more of a variety again. I'm fortunate to have it accessible. I just don't always take advantage of it. So I'm going to go to your website, excuse me, and get re-inspired.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Thanks for sharing that, Ruth. And yeah, I think one of the fun things about seafood, one of the things that why I love it so much is there is so much diversity. Like it'd be really hard to get bored of eating seafood because you could literally eat a different thing every day for the month and have seafood every night. Like there's so many different, you know, species that you could have and different ways to prepare them and things like that. So like, I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, I don't like seafood, but like literally like you've probably tried, you know, a few things, but there's got to be something that you do like. And I think that there's so much variety kind of available to us.
Yeah.
I think what you pointed out about resistance to people eating whole fish is important because that is, you know, there's not a lot of fish that fillet well. So that would be a major accomplishment to like have people simmer a whole fish and garlic and tomatoes and onions and white wine and enjoy it.
When we do our
big mental
classes, we try to focus on the whole fish, and whether it's breaking down the whole fish, or you know, or cooking it whole, kind of. That's one of the things that we do try to work on, kind of with people, because I think it can be intimidating. It was intimidating to me the first time I did it, and now it's something that I, you know, feel really comfortable with. But I think it's, you know, taking that initial step to try something, whether it's trying a new species or trying to cook with like a whole fish or things like that. I think it, you know, sometimes just just trying it and giving it a shot, you realize it's not as bad as you think it's going to be, or as difficult as you think it's going to be.
Is the fish really available? Like, I don't mean to sound really naive, but
No,
I don't
that's a good
actually
question.
eat a lot of fish. So I don't go into fish markets. If you go into our local fish markets, do you see scup available for sale and
So that's
monkfish?
one of the things that like it is difficult, for example, to find some of these species in the marketplace, especially in a, I would say like a more traditional or fish market, like a kind of like a classic fish fish market or whatever, or like grocery store. Like if you walk into, like I don't want to call out any like particular grocery store, but if you just like walk into a normal grocery store, a lot of times you won't see a lot of these species available. You'll see kind of what I showed in that seafood case of like, you know, the imported haddock and the like that's not, you know, even though New Bedford's catching like a bunch of haddock, like they'll have stuff from elsewhere, or they'll have kind of like the swordfish steak and the salmon and like other things that are not kind of are as much of our local species. So one of the things that we can do as consumers is kind of drive up that demand by asking for those local species, saying, hey, do you have any scup, or do you have, you know, black sea bass or fluke or, you know, whiting or any of these species. Creating that demand is, we did interviews with a bunch of different retail markets. And we also did a citizen science project where we had people just like you, like volunteers, go to fish markets all over New England for 6 months. They got like a fish assignment every week, and they'd go and they'd ask for those species. And whatever things our citizen scientists saw was that those markets were telling them like, oh, we got this in this week because you asked for it last week, or like things like that. So creating that demand and asking does make a difference. You know, it takes time. Sometimes they might not have it right then, or they might not be able to get it in right then. But if you ask and, you know, your neighbor asks, and like, you know, you have enough people kind of asking, it does create demand. That being said, if you do want to try some of these these fish and stuff like that, I find that there are markets that tend to carry kind of a more wide variety of species. The Portuguese markets in New Bedford tend to actually have a really good selection of fish, as just one example. But in Providence, there's like a Asian market that has like a big selection. But there's also kind of this cool new fish market that like they've made a big effort to carry a bunch of local fish, and so like they have a good selection. So I think that like, you know, by you asking and like creating demand, like sometimes the markets will even be like, oh, like we don't have it, but like our, you know, we know this other market that does have it, or things like that. But I would say in New Bedford, the Portuguese markets tend to have a pretty good selection.
I was going to chime in and say that what's interesting is in a lot of the sort of traditional ethnic cooking, people have never stopped eating. I mean, they just always ate red fish in the Sicilian community, and they always ate whiting, and, you know, in the Portuguese community. And so, and they also ate it whole. And I actually remember one year we had a seafood throwdown, one of those Iron Chef style competitions, and the Portuguese chef who cooked the whiting and cooked the entire fish got penalized in the judging because of the bones. And he was like, well, hey, you told me to cook like that, I get points for using the whole species. What's up with this? This is how we eat it in my culture. So, you know, different ways of eating, but I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And it's kind of interesting to think about, you know, the things that we can learn from a traditional recipe that's maybe a home cook recipe too. And I, you know, I sort of love the way it all interweaves. So
Yeah,
for
like
sure.
how chefs cook in restaurants is a lot of times very different than how I cook at home. And so I think like we also have a Facebook group called New England Seafoodies. So if any of you guys are on Facebook, I invite you guys to join that group. But it's, you know, anybody can post to it. So we do have like seafood businesses that post in terms of like, we've got this available, or like, you know, join our CSF. But we've also got like, you can post like a question to the group. So if you're like, I really want to try scup, I live in this area, has anybody seen scup in their local market, you can ask. Or if you create a cool dish that you want to share that you're proud of, you know, say you cooked whiting for the first time or something like that, this is the group to share it to. It's a bunch of seafood nerds basically. So we'll applaud your dish.
I have a question. So like with the whole sustainability things, obviously huge right now. Do you have any resources, or do you know of any research that's been done, like as far as like the carbon footprint of a fishery versus the carbon footprint of like meat production, or like, because I think that's something that would be interesting to present to people.
There was a study that I can't remember it right now. If I find it, maybe I can send it to Hannah or Laura. But one of our partners for our research project, like he's an economist at URI, and he found a study and he sent it to us, and I can't remember what the study is called or where it was from. So otherwise I would, but they compared like meat production compared to like seafood production. And seafood was really low on the list in terms of carbon emissions, even despite, like obviously boats take fuel and stuff like that to to go out and harvest and everything like that. But despite that, like seafood was very, very low on the list of carbon emissions, and particular shellfish was like super, super low on the list. It was, but like even like just like fin fish and stuff like that, they were really, really low compared to like beef or pork.
Yeah, we would love to see that if you find it.
So I'll try to find it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, because this came up in one of our volunteer calls recently, and I was sort of thinking through this thing of like, especially like with one of the things, right, the center tries to do, we want to change the narrative of like, oh, fishermen destroy the sea and they don't care and blah, blah, blah. But then you'll go buy ground beef at Shaw's, you know what I mean? Like there's this sort of disconnect, I think, between what people think, like, okay, if you're worried about the environment, do you really realize what you're buying? You know what I mean? And like, if I live, and maybe this is something we can explore together in the future with a grant, I don't know, but like if we could consolidate into like some easy to digest slideshow, or like, here's a chart where like, nobody's going to read through a 10-page research report.
Right.
They will look at a few graphs and be like, oh my God, wow, maybe I do need to eat more fish because I care about the environment. And maybe now they're eating seafood, not because they wanted to try seafood, because they care about the environment. I don't know. Like, it's just, I've been thinking a lot through that lately, and I think it would be
that's a great point, because people don't think what all is involved in producing beef. And yeah, you burn some fuel going out to get fish, but think what all goes into feed and water and all that, just the production, what goes into production of feed for beef. So I think we should do that thing if we can, a chart with, because people don't think about it.
Right. And I know that's like a very complicated, it's not just like, all right, let's throw some stuff together. That's like a very large project.
Yeah, because I mean, most people don't eat, they eat seafood maybe once a week at the most on average, but they'll eat chicken or beef like all the rest of the days of the week.
Yeah, and
like the other way around, right?
Guidelines for seafood is seafood at least twice a week or whatever. And and most people don't do that kind of right now. So there's a lot of room for growth there. I mean, I personally eat seafood probably closer to 4 or 5 times a week, but I love it. But yeah, like there's a lot of room for growth.
Is there like a seafood producers association kind of thing?
Like in general? Like for
like there's probably, I'm sure there's the beef industry of America, Is there like a
I mean, there's different fishermen groups. Like there's a bunch of different kind of fishermen organizations,
right?
That, but like there'll be like the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association and like in Rhode Island.
I was thinking more on like a national, like like literally. I mean, I'm sure
there are some, but they're all kind of separate. Like there are national level groups, but I would say that there's not like one set one that I'm aware of that everybody kind of
right. Do you think that they'd be on top of something like the carbon footprint of seafood versus the beef industry? You'd think that they would have.
I don't think there's as much kind of like collaboration,
cohesive
cohesive collaboration that like you do see kind of with the beef industry or things like that.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that'd be a huge selling point if that could become like a mainstream, like, a video that's getting shared on Facebook, like, oh my God, like I can remember watching Food Inc. when I was in high school, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm never gonna eat a cheeseburger again. And of course I didn't stick to that, but like, I don't know, like it really made me think differently about stuff like that. And if there was something for seafood, like, especially with younger people, like I think that's something that we've very much try to focus on, and like maybe you have similar issues of like engaging younger people, like they're maybe not always interested
I think
in this.
younger people is a really important group to engage. Like we haven't done a whole lot with like young kids or school groups, just because like I'm the only full-time employee at Eating with the Ecosystem, so we're really small. So we just haven't really been able to
Don't apologize, Kate.
we
get it. We get it.
You know, like I grew up eating seafood. I didn't grow up in a fishing family or anything like that, but like I did grow up eating seafood. I've always loved seafood from the time I was a little kid. But like most of my friends didn't grow up eating seafood actually, and then they still don't eat a ton of it now. Kind of I cook most of the meals in my house for my roommate, and so she'll eat all the seafood that I cook for her, but like she's trying a lot of these species kind of for the first time, and is enjoying them now because she trusts me in terms of cooking for her. But like I think that for a lot of people, they didn't grow up eating seafood, so it's not part of their diets on a regular basis, and it's eating any seafood, like whether it's local or not, is kind of a stretch for them and a bit outside their comfort zones. So I think that like if you get more kids kind of eating when they're younger, then I think that makes a huge difference. One of our partners,
Have a good
we're
day.
working on a
Bye-bye.
couple different videos. He has a 10-year-old 9-year-old son who loves seafood. Like we have pictures of him just like eating whole whiting just right off the bone, or butterfish. He doesn't care what it is. He'll just eat like the whole thing, no big deal. Like because his dad fishes and brings home fish, and he grew up some of the time he was little doing that. And so I think it makes a big difference if you do grow up kind of in a household where you're introduced to seafood at a young age.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I know like with my age group, like, you know, I feel like there's this return to like, you know, people want to get into gardening and organic and like all these things that maybe sort of died out, and they sort of seem to be coming back on this new trend. And I'm like, if we could capitalize on that, like these same people that are, you know, 25 and have a garden in their backyard are the same people that if they understood like, oh, this is an easy change I could make and I can feel good about it. Like, I feel like that would be a huge way to engage. And then these younger people are the ones that are now having kids, and now they've got young kids, and now because this is in their head, it's like this trickle effect.
I agree. And I think you see more people focusing on like schools and institutions and stuff to a certain extent. I know I've noticed, like I've talked to more college classes this past year and like had more college kids kind of reaching out than we have kind of in the past. So I think like just the classes that they're offering at colleges and stuff now also I've noticed are like, I went to Holy Cross for undergrad, and I gave a talk to one of the the Holy Cross classes, and it was called Edible New England. Like we never had that class when I was there. And I mean, it's been a while, but like I'm not that old, I'm 32. So like, I feel like, you know, that was say like 10 years ago or whatever, when I was at college. And it's changed kind of a lot in terms of what classes are offering and like the conversations that they're having kind of at that level. And I think that you're starting to see that in elementary and like middle and high schools as well.
I think in New Bedford, I've been reading, I believe that so in New Bedford, all the elementary schools anyway, all had kitchens at one point, you know, and made food. And then when my kids were in school, I mean, my kids are now in their 20s, but when they were in elementary school, it was all Sodexo sort of prepackaged, whatever, I don't know, like a lot of sugary breakfast and all of that stuff. And I believe they are moving back in the other direction again and have purchased a building that's going to be turned into a kitchen that will create food to be served in the schools. And I don't know, Kate, if you're in touch at all with the Marion Institute.
I know of them, but I haven't been in touch.
So they have a program that's in a lot of the schools locally that it's called Grow New England or Grow something. I don't know, where they're getting kids to do little gardens in the schoolyards. But I think they are now also trying to get fish into the.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I can put you in touch with.
That would be great.
Whoever that is. And yeah, it would be so good.
My mom works at an elementary school. So I grew up in Maine. So my mom works at an elementary school in my hometown. But she runs she's a librarian, but she runs the garden program at both like the elementary school, like the kindergarten through third graders, but also the high school. And that they have like a farmer's market they do in the summer and stuff like that, because most of the produce is available when the school's not in session, kind of thing. But during the school year, they do raise produce that goes into the lunch program and stuff.
Yeah.
And I know they've done a lot with.
And I do think the whole idea of, I mean, food is such a connector, and it's such a way of, I mean, I even just remember kids seafood throwdown once where the kids were the judges and the chefs had to try to make kid-friendly food with, you know, underutilized species. It was super fun. But, you know, I think when kids are involved in either growing food in a garden or sort of, I don't know, tasting food that's being prepared in front of them in that kind of setting, it's, I mean, we all, you know, we're all more likely to try something new if it's presented in a fun way and it's available. And I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But thank you all. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's great.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been fun to talk to you guys.
Yeah, this has been awesome. And I'm with Ruth. I'm like, my fiance works at a fish market and I grew up in a fishing family and I haven't eaten like half of this stuff. So I'm like, I need to try all of this.
Get
like,
busy, yeah.
I know it's
Well, I've eaten a lot of scup sashimi, and it is really as good as any kind of sashimi if you're into that. And ceviche, we catch a lot of scup, so I'm on board with that for sure.
Scup, actually, my favorite is raw. I think that like
Scup is beautiful for that kind of thing, and you know it's a beautiful fish. Oh, I wanted to ask about the butterfish. Is that like in the mackerel family? You said it was kind of a more oily, or
it has more oils to it, but it's still very white. So it doesn't have like a red meat kind of at all.
Okay.
It's still very white kind of and flaky.
I'll try it. I haven't had
it. Has more oils. Like we did one of my favorite ways to prepare it is one that a friend showed me, that he butterflies it kind of. So you like you basically like go to fillet it, but you don't fillet it all the way, kind of. You cut the flesh off the bones on both sides, and then you can actually just cut the bones right out. So you have kind of like basically a boneless fish, but it's still kind of attached, like looks like a butterfly basically.
Okay.
But you could also do this with keeping it on the bones. But he like gently salts it, sets it in the fridge overnight. That helps kind of draw out some of the moisture. And then he just broils it the next day. Literally, like you don't have to put anything else on it. Like he doesn't oil it. He doesn't he just puts it in the broiler for like up close to the heat for like, I think it was like 5 to 6 minutes, something like that. And you see like it bubbling up and sizzling, and then like you can pull it out and eat it, and it's delicious. Like but it just has its own kind of natural oils. And actually it used to be a really popular fish in Japan. Like in Rhode Island there was there's a decent butterfish fishery, and that most of the butterfish used to go to Japan, and they used to buy them, particularly they loved them in like the end of the fall kind of leading into winter, which was when the butterfish had kind of eaten a whole bunch all fall, and then like right when it gets to a certain temperature they kind of stop eating because they're getting ready for winter, and so their stomachs are empty at that point kind of, but they're nice and fat, and they have lots of these like oils and fats and stuff like that. And that was like the peak time to have butterfish, according to the Japanese, was that like right when you got them when they were the fattest kind of.
Wow, that's interesting.
I'm gonna try.
That's
probably seasonal.
I have a question that may take a while to answer. So we'll see how this flies. So how does your organization feel about farmed fish, farmed seafood?
So as an organization, we focus on wild seafood within kind of our organization and our mission, but we've actually had conversations with our board and internally lately about the aquaculture thing more recently, and whether or not we want to incorporate kind of that into our work to a certain extent. And so where it stands right now is we are supportive of small scale kind of community-based aquaculture that doesn't harm the ecosystem or the wild fisheries and stuff at all. So is like, so basically like oyster farms, oyster farms or kelp farms, those small scale kind of like community-based things that they oyster farms, they filter the water, they actually produce habitat that's beneficial to wild fish and shellfish and things like that. And so we're supportive of those type of activities. Fish farming at this point is not something that as an organization we're supportive of. I think the way that I personally look at fish farming is that you're basically like, our whole thing at Eating with the Ecosystem is that we're asking consumers to eat what the ecosystem is producing, right? Like we've got this huge selection of seafood available to us. The ecosystems are a great food production system. When you're farming fish, you're basically catering to consumers that only want to eat like one thing or two things. So you're like, if you look at what species are being farmed in terms of fish, or like shrimp or fish or things like that, like it's salmon typically, and it's shrimp, and it's, there's different ways of doing it. Some ways are better than others, but like you're basically catering to people being very selective about what they want to eat. And I don't really think that doesn't really align with our mission super well. But also there are some negative impacts that fish farming on that scale can have. It's including like environmental impacts that do harm wild populations. And so at this point, it's not something that we're supportive of.
Kate,
guess I
you said
could have
that very nicely and diplomatically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Liz was more asking that question like as volunteers and people who are like,
Yeah, I mean,
fielding
we
these
could ask that
questions. Like, we're not supportive of it either. We're more like,
But
I
we're going to
think,
get that question the minute you get into conversation.
People
with us.
totally will ask you that question. So I mean, you guys probably have to like, think of as an organization, like how you guys want to answer that or whatever. And like, it can be different than ours. It's okay. But yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it, at least.
Do you guys have any information on your website about like some of those negative effects on natural habitat?
We haven't talked a whole lot about fish farming on our website, really. It's something I guess we probably could add at some point. One group that we're a part of is the Local Catch Network. And they're like a bunch of seafood producers and organizations and businesses that tend to focus on a little bit more direct sales kind of, but they are values-based seafood basically. And they have, if you're part of the Local Catch Network, you agree to these kind of set of values. And Eating with the Ecosystem is actually one of those values as a concept, not like us as an organization, but but the concept of eating with the ecosystem is one of those values. But there's a lot of other values that are on there as well, like fishermen first and fair prices, and also like environmental and like stuff, and like there's a whole lot of different factors, and they talk a fair amount about fish farming as
What was the name of that organization?
It's called the Local Catch Network.
Okay.
And Slow Fish is another one that actually there's a conference going so it's virtual this year, but like they had like Thursday and Friday, Saturday of last week was the first kind of 3 days of it. And then Thursday, Friday, Saturday this week will be the next couple days of it. And they talk a fair amount of it about fish farming and stuff as well. And they actually on, I think either Thursday, they're having a whole aquaculture panel to talk about those conversations.
What was that one called?
Slow Fish.
And I can put this in the chat as well, but another organization that's national that I think does a really good job on some of these issues is called Food and Water Watch. And so they have sort of position papers that kind of, issue by issue go through concerns about fish farming or whatever it is, whatever the issue is. But I find their stances to be pretty well thought out and researched. So we can put all this stuff in the chat. So Slow Fish.
Yeah, and
Local Fish Network.
Thursday, which is tomorrow, is the aquaculture conversation in the afternoon. I think they have like a panel going on. So for that, if that is a conversation you're interested in, you do have to register.
I'm not giving you links, but
you have to register, but it's not super expensive. And there's like a student thing and like fee, or like there's different price structures depending on like who you are.
We can send links out to you all volunteers with all
Yeah,
of
we can.
these
I
organizations.
think it was local catch network too, not local.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
Local catch
Catch. Oops,
network, yep.
my bad. Well, this has been super helpful, I think, for all of us in terms of thinking about these issues and how to kind of better engage visitors with thinking about how their choices impact the health of the oceans and the health of the community, the fishing communities. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Kate.
You're
Yes,
welcome.
Thank you, Kate.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Yeah, and hopefully I'll get to stop by the Fishing Heritage Center at some point in the near future.
Yes, well, we've been closed sadly
I
since the end of
know.
December, but I think we're weeks away now. So
Awesome.
yeah, very exciting. Liz, I don't know, did you have other things to talk to this group about this session, or are we?
Not
This is
really. I
it.
really hadn't
Okay.
prepared anything.